Welcome to Wildlife Rehabilitation from Rescue to Release, a podcast dedicated to licensed wildlife rehabilitators and the veterinarians who support them. I'm your host, Gail Buell. Techniques we discuss here are meant for licensed wildlife professionals. If you aren't licensed and trained for wildlife rehabilitation, do not attempt to capture, hold, or rehabilitate any wild animal. If you find an injured wild animal, a wildlife professional can recommend next steps. We will tackle topics about rescue, care, management, reconditioning, and releasing wildlife found in North America. This is a deep dive into each subject. We hope to give rehabilitators information they can use because they're already going to great lengths to rescue and nurse animals back to health. There are three possible outcomes in wildlife rehabilitation: release, euthanasia, and placement. An injured or orphaned wild animal's journey to restored health and independence in their natural habitat is delicate and complex. We draw techniques and expertise from many disciplines. Many animals brought into rehabilitation cannot be saved. The last gift we can give them is humane euthanasia. We'll talk more about when this is necessary. Sometimes animals are deemed non-releasable and evaluated to be suitable for a life in captivity. When that happens, we shift to a long-term approach to managing their care, training, and housing. Some such animals serve as ambassador animals, a term for animals that rehabilitators use to educate the public. Each episode, we'll speak with experts who represent specialty topics across the profession of wildlife rehabilitation, ambassador animal care and management, showcasing best practices. Welcome back. If you're just joining us, in episode 2, I spoke with Brittany Turner, Rehabilitation Director at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center of Minnesota, or WRC. We covered her wildlife rehabilitation career background and honed in on songbirds, one of her longtime interests and areas of expertise. In this episode, I'm back with the second part of my discussion with Brittany about rehabilitating songbirds. We cover the entire rehabilitation process from admission to release, including diets and housing. Our talk goes into detail about some of the special considerations for songbirds during that process, as well as some information about a recent development, metabolic bone disease seen at intake. By weight, these are some of the smallest animals we often care for, so extra attention to the details of their condition and care is extra critical. So let's get right back into it. Okay, so now we have, let's say a bird, and I'm going to let you can pick the species or not. We can do this very general, has come into the center. And for the wildlife clinic, so they fill out, the finder fills out the admit information at the front desk. The front desk staff brings the bird back into a holding space with heat and things like that. And then what happens?
Yeah, so I can try and do some specifics, but a lot of this is very general at this point. So Every baby bird, whether it is precocial, it is ultrashal, so if it's a duckling, if it's a songbird, every single baby bird needs heat. Heat support is very important when they come in. If they feel kind of warm to the touch, we still give them heat support. Depends on the age. So if they are that naked baby bird, we put them in an incubator immediately.
There you go. Okay.
Our incubators, I meant to look this up before. I believe we set them around 98 degrees. Birds run a lot hotter than people. So if it's a hatchling bird, I'll sometimes go up to 100 just to give that extra heat support to our incubator. But we also use our incubator temps. We just keep an eye on the bird specifically. But first thing first, warm them up. Don't give fluids if they're cold. Don't feed them if they're cold. We do this. We have to train interns every year. A lot of interns and volunteers. Hey, this bird's not eating. Why? Can I just force feed it? And it's always kind of our golden rule. Is it warm? Is it hydrated? Then you can feed it.
Good rules.
Yeah, big rule. Yeah. So heat support is super important. If that bird is not warm and you try and give it oral fluids or food, it won't digest it well. And it can actually hurt the bird. And this is for mammals too. But we're talking birds. So it can hurt the animal. So first thing we'll do, get them warmed up. Once they're warm, depending on the bird itself, if it's gaping, so if you haven't worked with a baby bird before, baby birds, once they're warm, they should open up their face, right? They're going to look at you. They're going to open up their mouth. There are some that do it weird, chimney swifts and then dove pigeons, which we can talk about in a bit. But your typical baby bird, they should open up their mouth waiting for you to feed it, right? They don't know your mom, especially when they're really little. They don't know. Their instinct is, I need to get fed, right? So they're warm. When you check on them, they should open up. If they're really dehydrated, they might not. But if they start begging after they're nice and warm, and when I say warm, you don't have to take the physical temperature of the bird, very invasive. But what we recommend to people is touch the bird's abdomen to your wrist, not your hand, but your wrist. If it feels like it came out of the refrigerator, it's too cold. If it feels like it came out of the microwave, it's too hot. You want it to feel warm to the touch.
Oh my God.
Right?
That is like the best description I have ever heard. And I will tell you, and I've dealt with a lot of songbirds, not as many as you, but I have that touching the abdomen to the wrist is a phenomenal technique. Because like my hands are always cold. I can't, if I handle any kind of baby, I have to have something in between me and the baby. And we should be wearing gloves anyway, but something that's kind of insulated because I will pull every available degree of heat out of these poor things.
Just really quick, funny thing. I'm totally opposite. I will sometimes, if we get in a really tiny hatchling or something that is super, super cold, my hands are really hot all the time. So I'll actually hold it between my hands and just warm up the bird because contact warmth sometimes is better than just air temp warmth.
Right. Oh my God. But that the wrist, that is awesome. I mean, I check when I'm doing orphan mammals, I check a lot of times the heat just to make sure it's not too hot on my wrist. What a great technique. Anyway, keep going. I
would love to take credit for it, but that's how I was trained. But it's really great. It's really effective. So again, you want it to be warm to the touch. So once your bird is warmed up, then we will give fluids. If it's gaping well, so it's begging, it's opening up its beak, you can do oral fluids. We use lactated ringers at our center. Lactated ringer solution, it's an electrolyte solution. I know some people use Pedialyte. As far as I know, it's just as effective, but we use lactated ringers. So we will orally hydrate the bird if it's gaping and it's ready to be fed. Oral hydration, I think it works faster. It helps the GI kind of reset itself.
And for some of those really small birds, giving subcutaneous or underneath the skin injections with lactated ringers is very difficult, and you can do damage so fast if you're not exactly knowing what you're doing. So oral rehydration, I think, is the way to go, especially for the really, really small ones.
Yeah. And then if it's not gaping or it's severely dehydrated, so when birds are severely dehydrated, usually their abdomen gets really flaky, wrinkly, like you can tell a healthy kind of bounced out abdomen. That sounds really weird for people who don't know birds.
I know exactly what we're talking about, but
right. Trick of the trade that I use to train interns and volunteers on hydration is if you gently press on the abdomen and it bounces right back, usually that bird's pretty hydrated.
Okay.
If you push in, again, gently, don't push real hard. But if you push into the abdomen and it stays pushed in, usually that bird is dehydrated.
And that would make sense. The tissues are sticking together and there's not as much volume in there. Yeah, makes sense.
Unfortunately, there are some birds that just seem like they're always dehydrated. I can't get into every little nook and cranny of things I know,
That's okay.
Just throw it in. Things like swallows, for some reason, always dehydrated, always. I've even looked at them in nests in the wild. They look dehydrated. I don't understand it, but they do what they do. Crows also are notoriously always dehydrated. So if they're dehydrated, oral fluids are the best. Otherwise, subcutaneous fluids are really effective as well. For us, we actually have a very specific admit protocol. I will see if I can send that to you as well. But for birds, we do 3 rounds of oral fluids.
Okay.
Our goal is we want that bird to poop. Sometimes we are just kind of praying for the bird to poop. But that means that the GI is working, that the bird is, I want to know that GI system is working, that its whole body is functional before we try and give food. So we make our volunteers, interns, do 3 rounds of oral. We do it based on the schedule that bird is getting fed. So if it's a really tiny bird, every 15 to 20 minutes, we do a round, and usually it's 5% body weight if the bird will accept it.
Okay.
Some birds can't take that whole 5% if they're not, if they stop begging. There's a lot of little nuances to working with songbirds.
Right. But in general, and that's what we're talking about here, that way people can really get a good idea of what the ideal is. And then we work from there. Yeah.
So we do 5% body weight in kilograms. No, in grams. Gosh, not in kilograms. 5% body weight in grams of fluids. We do 3 rounds of that for all of our baby songbirds that come in to make sure that they are properly hydrated. If they're not pooping, they don't look good, do a couple more rounds. I'd rather that bird be hydrated and push off feeding for another 1 or 2 feedings than pushing food too early. Which is really hard to tell volunteers who look at this bird who's just begging for food. And we're like, no, do not feed it yet.
Right.
You can do more harm than good. I mean, the public does it too, right? Where they are like, yeah, I gave it this. And I'm like, okay, let's stop, please, giving it that.
Yes.
Like, it'll be okay. I promise. Let us help first.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. We can turn them around quicker if you don't do that. So, yeah.
Right. So that's kind of the first. We get them warm, we get them hydrated before we can even feed them. At our center, our veterinarians do a full exam as well. So they look for any abnormalities, something that we have been seeing a lot more, and I don't have actual science to tell you why yet. We're trying to figure out if we can solve this a little bit more, but we're seeing a lot more metabolic bone disease.
On wild birds coming in?
Yeah.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Wow. Yeah. So we don't know if we're better at catching it now, and it used to be there and we weren't catching it as quickly before. But we do get quite a few now with metabolic bone disease. So for us, we can tell right away because their bones are bendy. It's really awful. It's really awful. I've felt it before and it makes me so uncomfortable. But a lot of times we'll end up with, like, their bones are already a little bit soft because they're babies. But their bones are extremely soft and fracture so fast. We've had birds that, like, you pick it up and you're barely touching its leg and it fractures. So we're seeing a lot more of it. And one of the species we see it, and I know that some places do not do invasive, but one of the species we see with metabolic bone disease and poor feather condition are house sparrows.
House sparrows.
My theory is they're coming from areas that they're eating garbage. So they're not actually, so they're coming from like the city where you see them on the street eating garbage and they're feeding their babies garbage. But yeah, we're seeing quite a bit of metabolic bone disease now.
And metabolic bone disease. Go ahead and explain it just very briefly to folks that may not know what it is.
Yeah. So what I understand of it, and if you have any additions, let me know. But basically the birds, it's a lack of calcium. It's a nutritional deficiency. So their bones get really, really soft. It can cause other organ issues as well. But for us, we see it a lot, mostly in the dog's paw.
I need to tell everybody that I can see this dog paw coming up into the view of the camera. And Brittany, you must be scratching Kona's belly. Oh my gosh, Kona is shameless.
He's not going to move. He's just going to be on his back this entire time.
That's okay.
So we see it a lot with their bones get really soft.
And it's an imbalance between the calcium phosphorus ratio. Is what it is. So when one is higher than the other, then the bones grow at the wrong rate and develop incorrectly. So that's where you'll get brittle bones, but you'll get bent bones. It's not nice.
Horrible.
You can stop it by having the animal be on proper nutrition. But if there's damage that's already done, like a bent wing or bent humerus or something like that, that's permanent most of the time. So, it's also, people might recognize the name rickets. That's what a lot of people used to call metabolic bone disease is rickets. So anyway, back to
throwing in with that too, with MBD, metabolic bone disease, we also will start supplementing with calcium. So we make a calcium slurry. Don't have the concentration off the top of my head, but we have been putting our birds on calcium specifically in addition to a correct diet with supplemental calcium. But we're basically just throwing calcium at them so that they can hopefully grow better. And we do have birds that come out of it. It's not like if they're soft bones, it's a done deal.
Right.
As you mentioned, it can be reversed. But it takes a little bit more work.
It does.
Vets look over the bird. So vets will look through, make sure there's no bone issues. They'll look over feather condition, which hopefully we'll have a whole feather talk at some point. But they'll look for the feather condition, though there's only so much that they can do with that. And then we do deworm our birds. I should say we give prophylactic medications to our birds. Okay. So we deworm the really wormy ones. I don't have the full list. I know.
It's okay. It's okay. So since you deworm all of them, what are you using, the same product or the same chemical for across the board?
Yes. So we don't give all of them dewormer. Okay. We only give it to certain species: blue jays, common grackles, American robins, and American crows. And I think I'm missing one, but I don't have the list in front of me. We give them Strongid. And then we do give all of our baby birds Panazaril to kill any coccidia they may be carrying. A lot of our birds tend to have coccidia, and it can flourish in care. So we do give a dose on admit of Panazaril as well as the next day. We give another dose. And then if they have mites or something, gotta look for those too. Bird mites are horrible.
Ectoparasites, yay. No, not so much. No. So they get their ectoparasites treated, or the ones on the outside of the body. Yep. That's what ectoparasites are. They get, you want to take care of the coccidia, so they get a couple doses of Panazaril, and then certain species get wormed with Strongid to kind of help, because they tend to be quote unquote wormy. Okay, so well, okay. So we've gotten through the exam. Anything else with the initial exam? I mean, they're looking in the mouth, they're looking at the wings. Do all of them get radiographed? I mean, some of these guys are really tiny.
Yeah, they're really, really tiny. And because we're such a high volume, we can't take radiographs of every single baby bird that comes through. Our veterinary technicians would murder me. So they only get radiographs if there is a fracture that the vets need a better look at, or they have some kind of other abnormality that we're worried about. Okay. A lot of our animals in general, we want to make sure they're stabilized though before radiographs. So we don't admit them and then come in the door. We don't do any supportive care and just throw them in radiology, right? They have to go a little bit under anesthesia. It's really rough. So we want to make sure the animal is stabilized. So usually we give them at least a day. Sometimes the veterinarians will splint the fracture or wrap if it's a coracoid. All those nice little shoulder bones in there. Might wrap the wing to the body just for overnight so it's stabilized before they can do radiographs. But we don't do rads on every single bird. Again, I think we would lose our minds if we tried that.
Probably would. And at some point, not during these episodes, I don't think, but in a future podcast, we might talk about injuries and how you deal with, especially with young birds and injuries like a fractured wing or something. Today, we're going to focus on, okay, this animal is healthy, relatively healthy, but just separated from his parents. So we can get the overview. So but the thing I want to point out to everybody is that supportive care started right away with heat and warming that animal up. So that's often one of the most important things that you can do. Don't go right away to doing an examination unless there's an absolute emergency. The bird is bleeding out or something like that. You want to do the supportive care first. Give them a chance to distress a little bit, because the whole process is a little stressful, right? Coming in a car and blah, 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 and now handled by a lot of people. Like, it's very disorienting. So we want to give them a chance to rest, have some support, then the exam gets initiated. So, okay, continue. I just took over. Right. Sorry.
No, you're totally fine. No, you're great. Yeah, heat support, you have kind of a double-edged sword if a bird has head trauma. Again, we're not talking about injuries right now, but if it's a known window hit, you have kind of that double-edged sword of the bird. I know window hits aren't going to happen with the tiny little incubator birds, but you have to judge if the bird's really cold, but it had head trauma. We usually don't put head trauma birds on heat, but then if it needs heat, it's kind of one,
you're right. It's a double-edged sword. And like I said, a future podcast, we're going to talk about injuries. Cause I think, it's the head trauma, wing fractures, leg fractures, all those kinds of things. Okay. It's on my list.
All right.
Okay.
No, you're good.
So, okay.
So they've gotten their supportive care. They're through fluids. We're ready for caging and food. Two very big things that we haven't talked about yet. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to kind of, so for feeding, this is a big topic. I'll start with, I'm not a nutritionist, but I've worked, I have used a lot of resources. If you work with birds, I highly recommend getting the book Passerine Fundamentals by Veronica Bowers. Mm-hmm. Huge resource. I think she's coming out with a new version. I don't know if it's actually available yet, but really important resource if you're working with birds. So in there, she talks about diets for baby birds. So a lot of people use a huge variety of diets for baby birds. And some of them, more hardy species, can get by with diets that are just okay. So we went through a lot of different diets. When I started, we were using Missouri hand feeding diet for all of our insectivores. Okay. Before that, we were using something called Fawn's diet, and then I can't remember the one before that. Yes, sorry.
Yep, that's okay.
It smelled horrible. And then in 2015, our Songbird nursery manager, co-worker of mine, was doing more working with Janine Perlman, who is referenced in that Passerine Fundamentals book. She is a nutritionist and worked on vitamin support for an all-insect diet for baby birds. So when I started, we were using a formula diet for everything, and then occasional insects. Insects are expensive. It's hard. In some places, it might be hard to get them. We're really lucky. We have a bug. They're called the Bug Company. They're up about 30 minutes north of us. So we're really lucky to have that resource nearby. But in 2015, we switched over for our insectivores. So not finches, not doves, not pigeons. They are not insectivores. For all of our insectivores, it is an all insect-based diet. It's really important if you're looking into doing that. Again, look into resources, because if you're just giving them bugs with no supplements, you can cause metabolic bone disease. The birds really need those extra vitamins. So in that Passerine Fundamentals book, there's the recipe for the supplemental vitamins that Janine Perlman came up with through actual research on it. So there's kind of two parts, but they're all vitamins. There's a calcium-based kind of paste as well as an oil. But it's daily vitamins, because in the wild, birds are eating spiders, they're eating caterpillars, they're eating beetles and moths and all sorts of huge varieties, whereas I can supply them mealworms and crickets and waxworms, and then the occasional other weird thing. So while we gut load, so with your insects, you want to feed them. There are lots of really good resources on gut loading insects. So it's basically making them more nutritious. So it's not just an empty bug that the bird is eating. It's not enough. We can't give them all of those little vitamins that they'd be getting in the wild with a huge variety of bugs.
Right.
As I mentioned, at our center, we primarily feed crickets and mealworms as the base diet for these birds, for all of our baby songbirds. For our robins, we'll throw in earthworms as well, because it's a very important source of their diet. Side note, earthworms can carry gapeworm.
Gapeworm.
I told you they're wormy birds. So just keep an eye on your robins. If you're giving them a lot of earthworms, even the ones that are sold can have tapeworm. Another parasite, noxious little parasites. Yeah, and then we'll give waxworms more of a variety as a treat. It's a fattier insect, not as good as for a staple bug diet for them.
Right.
And then you can throw in other more commercially available things. Some people really like dubia roaches. We haven't used them yet, though I'm looking into it. We've started experimenting with isopods this winter with our herp species, which has been a whole fun thing. And then occasionally we'll get commercially available hornworms as a treat because it's a caterpillar, and it hopefully will give them a little bit more nutrient.
Right.
Those are the diet. When they're babies, you're hand feeding those birds bugs, ideally. Again, some people have had really good luck with formulas. We used to use them and the birds were fine, but we noticed feather quality was significantly better. We had a lot less issues with soft bones and other kind of weird development.
When you switched to the insect-based diet with the vitamins, calcium added. Okay.
Correct. Sorry. Yes. Mm-hmm. So those are for the insectivores. I mentioned briefly house finches, mourning doves, and rock pigeons. We do not give insects because they are not insectivores. Mm-hmm. They are granivores. So they're eating seeds. Even as infants, their parents are feeding them seeds. Occasional bugs, their parents probably do. So don't come away from this and say, oh, she said they never eat bugs. I will very rarely say never for bird diets.
Sure, they're all opportunistic. Doves. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Why
if
not?
they can find it, they're going to eat it. So for those, we do give them a formula that is designed. Usually it's designed for parrot species. Right now we are using a formula called Rowdy Bush. Okay. We use Rowdy Bush Formula 3, but I'm working with our medical staff on changing that up a little bit for our pigeons and doves, but not going to get too much into that today.
No problem. Okay. Oh my gosh. Okay. So that, and at every life stage, you're feeding that, right? So whether it's, size appropriate, obviously is going to be different for a nestling than it is for a fledgling, but pretty much the same across the board. As far as, since we're talking about feeding, how much do you feed at each feeding?
Yeah, it's been a fun experiment that we've been doing. So we aim for 5% body weight, pretty much across the board. And now you're going to say, how do I make a cricket into this many, right? Because it's 5% body weight, usually in milliliters. So if you're giving fluids, right, and you're like, okay, I have to give this 0.5 mils of feeding, and now I have this many mealworms.
Right.
So we kind of estimate how much could fit in that syringe. And a lot of times for baby birds, they will tell you when they're done. So
okay, I need a clarification here. Okay, just clarification. Mm-hmm. So you're doing an insect-based diet with all the calcium and all the stuff like that. When you are feeding the really young ones, you're taking that the insects and stuff and you're grinding them up? You're putting them in a blender?
No. You can for the hatchlings. Okay. It's in that book that I mentioned. Right. We don't. I more use the syringe as a kind of a guide, right? You have this much, this is 5% of the body weight, right? How many, kind of picturing it, how many crickets / mealworms would fit in there?
I understand. Thank you for that clarification.
Yes.
I'm like, sorry. What are you doing?
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Most of them, we will be feeding that diet until they are fledging. We will be giving them insects because that is what they're eating until they start self-feeding. So right around that fledging stage, they start experimenting with food. And then they might start picking up, and we'll offer them fruit in their dish so that they can start learning how to eat what they need to eat. Mm-hmm. But we'll still offer hand feeding of exclusively bugs for most of our species. Okay. That being said,
Yeah. So right. And all that makes total sense. So back to, because I'm the one who derailed you. But how much? How do you, is it crop size? Is it that they seem healthy, so they just stop eating, or a little bit of both?
So it's a little bit of both. So what we do is we have it pre-calculated. This is about how much they should be eating each feeding. We have a food sheet for each species or group of species. We group our sparrows together, and we group our finches somewhat for general diet. Here's my plug for if you're looking for what your bird needs long-term for diet. I highly recommend getting Cornell or signing up for Cornell Birds of the World.
If you're an NWRA. Yes. Yeah. If you're an NWRA member or if you're a member of Washington Wildlife Rehab Association, those two, that state organization and the national organization, there's probably others. If you're a member of those, you have access to Cornell. So continue about Cornell because that's a great resource. I try and put it in almost every talk I do ever now. At some point, they'll start paying me, right? Yeah, sure they will.
Right. So it's a really amazing resource if you're interested in birds or working with birds. They have just a plethora of information from what diets they would need to what they're eating as babies to how many days it takes to hatch and then how much the parents are involved and exactly what they look like at different ages if that data is known. So here's my plug for if you're working with birds, highly recommend to know what you're doing. That being said, how much to feed? So it depends on the bird. What I usually train to volunteers is here's a guideline. This number of bugs is about that 5% body weight range. Try and feed them all of that. But if they're not eating all of it, don't panic. Sometimes baby birds, you'll feed them, let's say they need 5 mealworms. You'll feed them 3 and then they fall asleep and they stop begging. I don't want that person to then pick up the bird, try and open its beak, force feed it those extra 2 mealworms. Most baby birds will tell you when they're done. They'll just stop begging. They'll go to sleep. They're done. There are some species that won't do that they will eat until they drop. I'll just throw it in. House finches, again, they're on formula, but those things never stop begging, ever. Cedar waxwings, their crop will be gigantic and they will still be begging. They're just ridiculous little birds. Those are my 2 big problem children for this kind of rule of feed them until they stop. As we're talking crop, so you mentioned it, do I look for the crop? So that's how I was always trained is you look on the bird's right side. So the bird's right side is where you're feeding them. That's where usually the esophagus is going down into the crop. So if you're feeding a bird, which could be a whole talk in and of itself, but when you're feeding a baby bird, you want to avoid the glottis. So that's the path to the airway, the big hole right behind the tongue. You want to avoid that. You don't want to get food down it. You definitely don't want to get liquid down it. A healthy baby bird, usually it's easy to put their food in the right side of their neck. Super easy. For crops, I was always trained. You watch the crop until it looks pretty full, which is how I started. And I was like, okay, that's very vague. As I learned more, found out a lot of birds don't have a true crop. Some birds have double crop. Some birds don't have a crop at all.
And a crop, for those of you who don't know, it's just an extra pouch. But it's basically its function is a storage spot. I can eat a whole bunch, stick it in this spot, and then it can slowly go down to my stomach to be digested. That's, the really down and dirty kind of description of a crop. So continue.
Yeah. So some birds like house finches and house sparrows, their crop is pretty obvious. When you're feeding them, you can see the side of their neck filling up with food. There are a lot of birds that it's really hard, or if they have feathers and you can't really see the crop very well, it's hard to say, okay, watch for the crop. Again, most birds will tell you when they're done. As for timing, that's extra fun. So we do it a lot by visual. I learned how to do it. I've trained our Songbird nursery director. She trains all of our managers who train the interns. But the managers, our staff, are the ones upgrading birds. And it's kind of hard to tell you without showing you. I'll see if we have a resource that I can share of kind of, we're working on more weight-based when to upgrade them. But that's a lot of time that we haven't had yet. We're hoping, right, to robins, at this weight, they should be on this timeline.
Sure.
We're not there yet. We're working on it.
Okay.
But for us, what we do is if they are in the incubator, so they are hatchling to early nestling, so they don't have, right, their feathers are not fully grown out. They're still fully reliant on incubator temperatures to stay warm. We feed them every 15 to 20 minutes. Mm-hmm. Some people not fight.
From what time to what time?
Sorry. Yes, we try and do about 12 to 14 hours a day.
Got it.
Because we're so high volume, we typically go about 12 hours. So we start feeding them at 8, and then we finish around 8 or 9, depending on how fast things are going that day.
Right.
So aim for about 12 to 14 hours. They do not need to be fed overnight. That's something I get asked constantly. They're not mammals. Leave them alone. Let them sleep.
Yep.
So they're fed every about 15 to 20 minutes for about 12 hours a day, which is a lot. Why we have so many volunteers. So those are going to be your incubator stage babies. So again, they're the ones that are either naked or very, very thinly feathered. So they might have some feathers coming in, but they need that thermal regulation. We say 15 to 20. Some people argue back that the parent birds aren't necessarily every species feeding their babies every 15 to 20 minutes, which might be true, but that's about how fast they're digesting. So that's about where we go. If you have to push it to 30, most birds are fine with that. We go 15 to 20 so that if we get a little bit busy and we kind of are airing around 30, the birds are totally fine. So some places do 30 when they're infants. I say infants, sorry, hatchling and early nestling. We do 15 to 20. But if that bird, if you can see the crop or they're not begging after that 15 minutes, give them another 15 minutes.
Yep.
And then if they're still not begging, right, and at that point they should be hungry again, check their temperature and check their hydration, because you could be facing they're too cold or they're dehydrated, which is what we typically train people to do. So 15 to 20 minutes when they're incubator, hatchling, and early nestling. Once they are starting to try and jump out of the nest a little bit, they're getting a little bit more mobile. They're just driving us all insane in the incubator. We'll move them, right? We'll move them into the next stage, which is every 30 minutes. And then we can go into a little bit of caging while we're going through the stages.
Yes, please.
So in the incubator, they are in, I'll see if I can get a picture for a resource. But in the incubator, they're not moving around a whole lot. A lot of people like to use critter keepers. They're kind of those little, like, I think of them as hermit crab cages.
Right. Yeah. They're the clear plastic kind of rectangle things with the colorful top. Yeah.
With the little door on the top. Yeah.
Yes. With the little door on the top.
We use those. Keeping the lid on versus off depends on the species. Some birds overheat, which is a whole nother thing. As you're working with the bird, if it's begging, what we tell our volunteers, if it's begging, most likely it is warm and hydrated.
Okay.
Not 100% of the time, but I don't want somebody handling the bird every 15 minutes of, okay, is it warm? Is it hydrated? Okay, now I can feed. If that bird is begging, we default to, it's probably warm and hydrated. Again, this is way after advent.
Oh, right. Yep.
Yeah. In the incubator, we use toilet paper nests, and you may have seen crochet nests, but it's kind of little fake bird nests. They're really messy. They poop everywhere. So we use toilet paper on the inside so that we can easily change that out.
And do you change that with every feeding? Oh, at least 3 times a day. So you may not be doing it every time.
Right. We go until, we do, it depends on the day, like how many people are in there for the day. Sure. But some birds will poop over the edge of the nest, and it's so much nicer.
Yes.
And then they're like, toilet paper isn't getting gross. Those are my favorite. And then you have things like starlings who just poop everywhere. And it's gross. Love them, but they're disgusting. So incubator, they're in those kind of fake nests. After that, what we use for housing most of our birds are butterfly mesh cages. You can get them on Amazon. For our 30-minute birds, we'll usually start them in the 12 by 12. It's a little cube. It's mesh on all sides. The reason that we use this is to protect the feathers as they're growing in.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a much softer material. I know a lot of people use those wire bird cages, which a lot of times can work just fine. But if that bird is sticking its feathers through the wires constantly, it can start damaging those feathers.
Mm-hmm.
So we use mesh cages. We've just found they're really safe and softer for the bird. So we'll do that. We'll put a pillowcase on the bottom. We'll move their nest with them so that they can stay in the nest as long as they want. And then they are on a heating pad on low for that remaining nestling stage. So while they're mostly feathered, they're out of the incubator, but they still need a little bit of temp support. Those birds are fed every about 30 minutes, same 5% of body weight. And again, they're still insects. So once they are starting to perch a lot, they might start picking at their food. We do start offering them food in cage dishes. So we'll start, usually when they're really little, we just offer dry so that they're not sitting in fruit, which they used to do, and then they get all sticky and messy and wet.
Yes. Ick.
Yeah. So we started offering that once they start perching, we'll offer the wet food. Until then, it's dry food. So once they're starting to perch, they're flapping a lot more. They're more active. We move them into the next stage of mesh cage, which is 12 by, I think it's 24. It's the next stage up of mesh cage.
All I'm seeing for everybody who's listening, I just see Kona's nose coming up from the bottom of the screen.
Ridiculous.
Shameless.
Such a distraction. I know, right? So we'll move them into that next set. Put a perch in there as well. So once they start perching, you want that perch. I'm going to use my push right now. Don't use those flat dowel perches. So those standard, like I buy a budgie cage at the store and it's that really smooth wood and it's a beautiful perch. They are horrid for bird feet.
They are.
Horrible. They're so awful. That's why my personal dove that I have at home has foot issues, is because that's what he was on his whole life.
Yeah.
Not going to go too much into why today, but you want to perch with texture. So we use sticks from outside. As long as it's a healthy wood, it doesn't have insecticide on it. We use sticks from outside because it has varying textures. It's bumpy. Usually it's different thicknesses. Birds can get a lot of feet issues if you're not using correct perches, but I'm not going too much into that today. In that cage as well, when you put the perch up, make sure it's far enough from the back. We use binder clips to hold the perch on those mesh cages because those mesh cages are really not flimsy, but flexible.
Flexible, yeah. Oh, that's a great suggestion. Yeah.
Yeah. So we use binder clips and we usually cut the perches to be the right size. Make sure there's enough space between the perch and the back of the cage for that tail to grow in. You don't want that tail to be constantly rubbing on the back of whatever cage you're using.
Right.
The feathers will start to fray. They start to lose some of those little barbs and can cause a lot of tail damage. And then at this stage, they'll have a little water dish. They'll have their food dish to start feeding themselves. And we move them up to about every hour. Once they're starting to eat on their own, they're learning. They're trying to figure out life. Not well, but they're trying.
The water dish, is it big enough that they can jump in and take a bath? About how deep is it? I mean, what kind of...
It all depends. Yeah, so it depends on the species. So we use a lot of peanut butter jar lid kind of dishes. So when they're just starting, we usually will give them, it's pretty shallow, enough water for them to drink, but not necessarily always enough to bathe in.
Right.
Some species, though, we'll try and bathe in it. So we'll give them a little bit more. We use those plastic planter saucers that you can get from plant stores.
Yeah, they're wonderful. They're easy to clean.
Work so
and
well.
Lots of sizes. Yeah, they're great.
Yeah, and baths are really important for birds that take them. Fun fact, house sparrows and I think house wrens, we've started doing it too. We actually give them sand. We buy play sand from the store because they take dust baths in the wild.
Dirt baths.
Yep. We do it for our wild turkeys too, but those are not songbirds.
That's right. So playground sand, if you get playground sand, it's already got all the big rocks out of it and you don't have to worry about.
Super fine.
Yeah, it's super fine. So it works great for things like that. So, okay.
Yeah. So that's up to pretty much they're starting to eat on their own. After that, we move them to outdoor caging. I do want to just really quick, because I know we're running lower on time.
We're good.
I do want to quick mention when you're housing the songbirds, most of them do really, really well in those mesh cages. The only thing is woodpeckers do not use mesh cages. So we have not had this happen to us, thankfully, but I have heard of it happening with other rehabbers. Long story short, woodpecker tongues have barbs on the end. And when they're trying to find food, they stick their tongues wherever they can fit them. And I have heard some horror stories of them sticking their tongues through those mesh cages and getting the barb stuck, and then their tongue is stuck and they can't get their tongue back. For woodpeckers, we use more of those typical like metal bird cages, so like wires. And we try and put as much vertical wood perching as we can.
Mm-hmm. Kona is making funny noises over there.
I can't help it.
She's laughing because that's okay.
Yeah, so we'll put enough vertical wood perches so that their tails are not going through the bars and their tails are supported better. Mm-hmm. But caution of woodpeckers don't do well in those mesh cages.
Yeah, and that's also following natural history, right? So to me, natural history should guide almost all rehabilitation.
Oh, absolutely.
Right. And so knowing that, and that's the other thing. I mean, when we have our little podcast on feathers, we may have to have one on just all these adaptations, and woodpeckers are amazing. And yes, I love them. They're near and dear to my heart. And one of the reasons is that tongue. So we won't go into the details on that but the tongue is amazing on woodpeckers. Okay. So all of those really, really good points for setting up an enclosure. Do you cover it with a towel at all? Like those butterfly cages?
So what we do is we actually clip a pillowcase to the front to create a visual barrier. Mm-hmm. So it's so that the birds aren't seeing us constantly walking by. So we want, when working and raising with songbird babies, they know that you're giving them food, right? Mm-hmm. The necessity that has to happen. But we do not want them to get too comfortable with us. So we push for all of our volunteers. Interns don't talk to the birds. A lot of people are tempted to sing and whistle to the birds. While I don't necessarily know that that's doing any harm, so if you're doing that and it's working for you, I don't know for sure. But we try not to, because I don't want that bird to associate anything sound we're making to being the sound that they should reference in the wild. Right. So we want them to, again, they have to know us for food, but once they get older, we don't want them associating us with anything, because that's dangerous for the bird to associate people with food once they're ready for release. Right. The visual barrier in the front, which I think is enormously important. Do you have, because and most people may not know this, but for the vast majority of songbirds, they have to learn their song. They don't just come out of the shell knowing it. So they have to practice it and learn it and things like that. But I know studies have shown that if you have like playing in the background all kinds of birdsong, including their species, that they will learn their species. So do you have like white noise in the background? Do you have birdsong? Do you have, and the other thing I want to just put in here is that you really want to get a certain species with their conspecific. So you don't want to raise one house sparrow by itself. You want to have more than one, because they can learn from each other and see each other and recognize each other at that point. So anything about song and anything about conspecific? Yeah. Real quick with visual barriers, I'll mention too, actually last year frosted the front of our incubator doors, because those are usually clear. So it still lets light in, but doesn't, but creates a visual barrier. So you can buy like sticky stuff that you just stick on there, or if you want to, buy spray paint and just frost the inside. That's what we started doing. That's a great idea. Yeah. It worked really well, surprisingly. Well, then you don't have to cover it either with a towel or something like that. I mean, because that's, of course, our go-to most of the time. So, that's a great idea. Yeah. Okay, so we usually have white noise machines in all of our wards just to try and drown out all of the human noise. We currently don't play birdsong. I know a lot of people do. I think for us, it's just the trying to get the logistics of it. Right now, we are not doing it. If you do use birdsongs, a caution, make sure that there's not or be careful if there's any predatory bird sounds on it. Things like blue jays, things like right? A lot of things are like, oh yeah, blue jays, like you want to hear their song, and they are predators for a lot of baby birds. Just be careful with that. Otherwise, just throwing on with the birds don't come out of the egg knowing their song. Some do.
Ooh.
Don't ask me which species. I can't remember, but I know that some of them do start learning their song in the egg.
Well, and I know, we're talking altricial birds today, but when we eventually get to precocials and talk about ducklings and stuff, definitely before they're hatched, they are talking to mom and mom's talking to them. And I would imagine that makes sense to me that would also go right to altricial, whether or not the altricial in the egg is talking back, but they're hearing mom and dad and all that stuff. So yeah. There's so much we don't know yet either about how they learn their song and all of those things.
Yeah, huge push, put them with conspecifics. So conspecifics, birds of the same species. If you don't, right, let's say you have a song sparrow and a chipping sparrow, you only have singles of those, try and put them together once they're a little bit bigger. Some species you have to watch for bullying. Some are a little pushier than others. But we will, if we have a single grackle in our outdoor flight cages, we'll probably put them with our baby starlings because they are similar and they usually get along for the most part. But yeah, conspecifics is a huge thing for them to learn from one another, stop associating us with food, and especially for those really intelligent species like blue jays, crows. We don't see ravens, but ravens as well. Any of those corvids, they are just too smart for their own good.
Yes.
Absolutely need conspecifics, or they get really, really close to people too fast. Right.
And if you're not careful, then they're become non-releasable because of it.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a really good caution. And so that's also a plug-in for working with other rehabilitators if you can in your area, transferring to or transferring to somebody else or taking another one in, I should say. So we've got to the point where these animals, they're outside, they're on natural branches, they are eating mostly on their own. You might be supplement feeding several times a day, but not like every 15 minutes or 30 minutes or an hour anymore. How do you go about, and again, in a very general way, how do you go about release?
I will throw in, I know.
Please do.
I went general. One thing that, especially if you're an individual rehabber or a smaller center and have access to natural foods, do it. Use them. If you have someone who has natural berries growing and they wouldn't mind cutting off a branch, make sure it's something that is not poisonous. There is another podcast that, Gail, you did. I can't remember who with.
Wild Foods for Wildlife. That's the website. And I'll make sure it's in the show notes again. If you have not listened to that episode, I would highly suggest it. It was so good. And we went in depth on this website. But even just going to the website and exploring there will help you a lot with natural foods.
So push for natural foods if you can get them in and provide them to your birds, even if it's once a week, teaching them what to look for in the wild, especially things like waxwings who need to learn how to eat berries off of branches. Right. We mimic that, though. We will sometimes put like bits of strawberry on branches that are like have a bunch of sticks so that they can kind of learn that skill. But if you have natural foods, huge push to using them. Okay, release. It's a whole big topic, but what we do, right, we have them as sledging. We'll move them once they are mostly self-feeding and or, right, they're starting to fly. If you have the space, put them in an outdoor enclosure as soon as you can, assuming weather is good where you are, and you have the space to do it. But we want to start building that flight muscle as soon as you can. And from our experience, when they go outside, they start hearing wild birds. They start getting a little bit more independent. They start playing around with food on the ground a little bit more, or hanging dishes. We put hanging dishes of food as well. So they learn food isn't always on the ground. We don't have a specific exactly this amount of weeks outside. We go until the birds are waterproofed. So if you spray them with a bottle of water, the water should bead on their feathers. They're not waterproofed. Most likely if you release them, they're going to get really wet in the rain and get really cold and not do well. So we want to make sure they're waterproofed. You want to make sure their feather condition is almost perfect. There are some little bits. Like some birds do okay with a few tipped feathers. It's not something I can go into fully today. Maybe with feathers we can talk about it.
Yeah, we'll talk. We'll do it then. Yeah.
But you want to make sure that that bird is able to fly really well. Ideally, it can bank, right? So it's not just, can it fly from this spot to that spot? But if you go near it, can it kind of do different maneuvers and try and get away from you? And that's a big thing too. Is it getting away from you? If that bird is still opening its beak when you're walking up to it, it's not ready for release. Some people do soft release, but we typically do hard releases just based on what space we have. So soft release is they're in an enclosure. You're able to open the door, let them come and go as they please for X amount of time, depending on the species. You supplement food while they're learning to be wild. Hard release is you do what you can while they're with you. Once they are as suited for wild as they possibly can be in rehab, you release them somewhere.
An appropriate habitat.
Yeah. So that's what we look for. Waterproof, feather condition is good. They're avoiding people. And then foraging as best as you can. So we'll sometimes provide leaf trays. We'll throw leaves, we'll throw bugs. We'll watch for them to sit and kind of pick through the leaves and find bugs, or put bugs on branches and see if they're trying to forage on their own. For robins, we give them dishes of dirt with earthworms, and then we will watch them dig through the dirt. A lot of what they know, it's instinct. We don't train our robins to dig through the dirt and pick up an earthworm. A lot of it's instinct, but you have to give them the ability to express those instincts.
Oh, right. The opportunities to learn and to do that. Yep. And explore that. You bet. You bet.
Yeah. I think that's most of it.
Most of it. Oh my gosh. Yeah. This time just flew by. Ha ha ha. Bad bird pun. And Brittany, if you're willing, I'm going to have you back.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, good. Because we have so much to explore. I want to thank you so much for being here and talking to me about songbirds and that general care, but we got a lot of really good detail in there too today. So a lot of good technique things and everything. And I just love your insights and your love of birds. I just so appreciate it. So appreciate it. So thank you so much again. And oh my gosh, I can't wait to have you back.
I know, I'm excited. You want little weird bird facts? I've got you.
I want weird bird facts. Weird bird facts. And we will have...
We could do a whole talk on weird bird facts too.
Okay, I'll write that one down too. As an upcoming episode.
Fun. I have them. I have so many.
And you have them. And maybe we could intersperse bad bird jokes too, because I have a lot of those. So anyway.
Yeah. I'm in.
You're in. Awesome. Thanks again, Brittany. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. All right.
That was part 2 of my in-depth discussion with WRC Rehabilitation Director Brittany Turner on caring for songbirds. Future episodes will have details on raising different groups and species of birds. By the way, if you're attending the 2023 NWRA Symposium this spring, be sure to check out our session on feathers. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Wildlife Rehabilitation from Rescue to Release, Season 2. Wildlife Rehabilitation from Rescue to Release is a production of Partners for Wildlife, working hand in hand with wildlife rehabilitators and veterinarians to improve the welfare of orphaned, ill, and injured wildlife. Our executive producer is me, Gail Buell. I'm the Partnership Coordinator for Partners for Wildlife at the University of Minnesota College of Veterinary Medicine's Raptor Center. To learn more about the Raptor Center and Partners for Wildlife, please visit us at raptor.umn.edu. Our producer is Kirk Clockey. Special thanks to our guest Brittany Turner, WRC, Partners for Wildlife, and the Raptor Center at the University of Minnesota College of Veterinary Medicine. And that's our show. Hope you'll join us again next time.